Okay, this is the review for the economy for the test. And this is part C on communism. Okay, this theory was first published by the Germans Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1848 in a book called The Communist Manifesto. So pay attention to the dates. We saw that Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and then the Communist Manifesto was published in 1848. So we can assume, and we will see, that the Communist Manifesto was a reaction to the rise of global capitalism. Okay, so first came capitalism, then came communism. Why? Because one of the major reasons for the emergence of communism was that it was a critique against the capitalist system. So all the disadvantages that we just saw of capitalism are articulated by Marx and then lead him to argue for a communist system. He claimed, well, two of them claimed, that the history of the world is a class struggle between the haves and the have-nots. Okay, important definitions here. The haves are the people who own the means of production, which is the same as the factors of productions, the land, labor, and capital from part one, right? And the have-nots are the workers who do not own those things. So, at all stages of history, Marx actually gives what's called a Marxian version of history, where he says all conflicts throughout history can be explained by this model of the haves versus the have-nots. If you look at the distribution of resources, it's always the people who have it fighting against the people who do not have it, right? And exploiting them in some way, right? He talks about the ancient Egyptians and their slaves. He talks about feudalism, which we saw last year, right? And puts them all into this Marxian model of those who have and those who do not have, okay? In Marx's time, in the 1800s, the factory owners, who were the haves, oppressed the workers, who were the have-nots. The workers are also called the proletariat, right, as I accidentally left in one of your questions, which he thought was going to cause a revolution. So you have the haves oppressing the have-nots, as always, and he believed, this is his prediction, that this could cause a revolution, possibly violent. He said that when the workers obtained control, they would destroy all ownership of private property and that classes themselves would disappear. So he believed that people would have a real class consciousness that they would use to cause a revolution, and then those classes would disintegrate because all of the owning of the factories would be done by the workers, right? So everybody does everything. Everybody manages and everybody works, okay? So you don't have someone who's an owner, someone who's a manager, and someone who's a worker. No, all of the people do all of the things, okay? And they all share the profit. So, how did Marx think this was going to happen? Because he argued that capitalism had two important inner contradictions which would inevitably lead to its downfall. So that he believed that capitalism was destined to fail for these two reasons. Number one, the worker is not paid the full value of what he or she produces. The rest is surplus, which is extra, which is the factory owner's profit. So, you're making a beautiful chair, right, that goes to market and sells for 200 euro, some really artisan chair, and your boss only pays you 20 euro, right, and he keeps the rest. Well, he says that this is inherently unfair and causes tension, right, and will lead to a revolution. The factory owners are forced by competition to attempt to pay the workers as little as possible to increase their profits, and this creates conflict between the classes. So, the problem, he says, is not that the factory owners are evil people, it's the system itself. Why? Because they have to pay the workers as little as possible. Because if they don't increase their profits, they can't compete against the other factories. And if they don't compete, they will close. Right? This is a capitalist system based on competition, right? Where if the person across the street from you is selling the same thing for cheaper, everybody will buy it from him because everybody has that freedom in a capitalist system, and you will go out of business, right? You will have to close your shop. So, the same thing happens. Labor is also considered a commodity in the capitalist system. So there's something called the labor market, which also follows the rules of supply and demand. If you have a lot of people who are unemployed and looking for a job, you can offer them much less of a salary and they'll do the same job, right? If there are very few unemployed people, right, and you don't have a lot of choice and you have a lot of jobs that need to be filled, right? The factory owners have to offer a higher salary to attract those workers. Otherwise, they'll go somewhere else, right? If they have the freedom of that choice. So he says that because of this system, the factory owners always have to pay them as little as possible. And this just inevitably leads to conflict between the classes. Okay. Marx predicted that the struggles of the working class against the attacks of the capitalist class would lead the working class to establish its own collective control over production, and this is the basis of socialist society. So, what is the basis of socialist society? Collective control over production. That means that everybody owns the factory together and everybody decides how much they should make of everything, right? And how the factory should run. So far, the Marxian process is you have a capitalist system, it's inherently flawed, you have a revolution, and socialism is established. Socialism means that all the workers have control, right? So, socialism, as Marx predicted, would be the first phase of communism. And this is a democratically planned economy with common ownership of the means of production. So what this is everybody owns part of all the industries, right? Workers would be paid directly according to how much they work, and surplus would be distributed collectively after state expenses. So if there's extra wealth in society, everybody gets a fair share, right? So in a socialist system, the state, which is democratic, supposedly, plans the economy entirely. And it's not looking for a profit, it's looking to make sure everybody has enough. So it's looking to distribute the resources in a fair way, right? We'll compare the two systems. We'll compare capitalism and socialism a little later, but remember, capitalism values freedom and profit, and socialism values equality. So these two systems are inherently sort of opposite, and we'll see where we fit in along the spectrum between the two. All right. After socialism, you have evolution, not revolution like before. Now it's evolution, and supposedly this socialist system, this is Marx's imagination, would evolve into something called communism, where a society would leap forward and everyone would have plenty of personal possessions. Classes would be abolished and class society would end. Eventually, the state would wither away and become obsolete. So, everyone has plenty of things, there's no more classes, and now there's no more states, there's no more government, there's no more police, because nobody needs it. As people administer their own lives without the need for government or laws. So, as Marx has already explained that in his vision of history, all of the conflicts that have ever existed have arisen because of the haves and the have-nots, and the conflict between them. He says that if everybody has enough, there won't be any conflict anymore, so we won't need police or government, right? That we will live all sharing happily together, right? So this is what's called a utopian theory, right? But this is what he thought was going to happen. People frequently confuse socialism and communism. One of the reasons why is because many socialist states, and undemocratic socialist states at that, have used the name of communism, right? People talk about communist Cuba. Well, that's absolutely not true, because in a socialist state, you have an enormous government, and in a communist state, supposedly you have no government. So if you have a dictator, that's a government that reaches into every aspect of your lives, which is the biggest government you could ever have. So that's the most socialist, right? If it were really communist, there would be no government. So the former USSR, how China was, and none of these have ever really been communist, okay? Communism has never ever existed, just as pure capitalism has never ever existed, right? Let's go on. So they are actually only theories. So you have a planned system and a free market system. Communism, capitalism. Socialism is in the middle, right? And this is a higher degree of government control and high level of social services, and a lower degree of government control and a low level of social services. So this is sort of one image of a spectrum that we can see in the world today. I like this one a little bit better. You have capitalism, socialism, communism, where you have some examples, like a more capitalist country, a country that has a fairly capitalist economy, is the United States, right? As you move more toward a socialist system, you get Canada, Sweden, and more toward a communist system, China, Cuba, North Korea, obviously the former USSR, right? But really, even this is not, it's not quite correct, because communism should really be way over here where it's never existed. This should really be socialist, and here is more what we would call mixed. Okay, so where would Spain be? Probably somewhere around Canada, depending on who's in government, kind of moves back and forth, right? These are not fixed things. Especially in a mixed system, you have, right, depending on what policies are in government and what's going on, over one generation, you can move pretty far to the left or to the right, right? But it's just the general tendency of things.